now there's a good opportunity to properly introduce Zoe, who's going to be talking to us today about community asset transfer. So Zoe is from Gateshead Council. And one of the reasons we wanted Zoe to lead this, how we did it on community asset transfer, is that Gateshead is really one of the leading councils in this area. They've passed around 45 buildings and spaces to communities, and this includes around 20 community centres, as well as community gardens, nature reserves, sports pitches, bowling greens, leisure centres, and even a boxing club. And Zoe herself is one of the people who are really on the front line of this work, so turning what can sound like a really nice idea into something that actually works in reality. So hello, Zoe. Thank you for joining us.
Hello. My pleasure.
Good. So can I just start with asking you, what fueled Gateshead to take on this approach to community asset transfer and to give so many buildings and spaces over to communities?
Asset transfer were formally introduced in sort of 2010, around 2010, by the Quirk report, which called for local ownership and management of public assets. But it really put a formal name to something that we had been doing for many years, which was basically granting leases to community organisations of things like sports pitches and community centres. We developed a policy and decided to actively encourage the idea and introduced a formal policy, first of all in 2012, and it's then been updated since then. And the policy really reflects now what's embedded into the council's vision and a whole strategic approach of encouraging volunteering opportunities and supporting communities to support themselves. We take the view that the voluntary sector has a vital role to play in service delivery. So it is beneficial for that sector to be strong and sustainable. And community asset transfer can help them do that because it gives them possibly several rooms where they can generate an income and also raise capital that the council can't actually access at all. It helps us too. It helps us rationalise our estate and make savings, but facilitates sort of continued service delivery of what I would describe as the softer or secondary activities that councils get involved with, enabling us to focus on the really key functions such as social services, which is that's sort of why we went down that route. We've updated our policy because not all buildings are suitable for asset transfer, and not all groups are suitable to take on an asset transfer either. We started doing them at nil consideration, but as a surveyor, I got to the point where I thought this isn't appropriate for quite a few of these. We should be having rent reviews in them. We should be charging rents and things like that. So not everything is done for nil consideration now. And the main way we do it is by granting a 35-year lease, quite often alongside a partnership agreement, which will set out what we're trying to achieve in terms of service delivery from that.
Great. And so in your view, what does make a space and what does make a group suitable for community asset transfer?
A space, the most successful ones that we've done, I suppose in a nutshell, are ones which are already being used by the community, but have that potential to deliver more than they currently do. Sort of as you've mentioned, we had a number of properties that transfer community centres. And what tends to happen is when we were looking after those, you'd have one person looking after maybe a dozen community centres. They had a budget and they had an income target. And once they'd hit that income target, that was fine. They'd done what they had to do, and that's when they would stop and they would concentrate on other things. That's not what groups do. They just keep going because they just think, well, if I can have one group working out of that room, why can't I have 4 or 5 during the day? And you just increase income, think, oh, what other groups could we have in here, and just accommodate as many people as you possibly can. We also have done some of the larger leisure buildings. There was the indoor bowling centre, which isn't 10-pin bowling, but it's actually Crown Green Bowls, where the bowlers from outside go in the winter to practice. And that was more challenging because sometimes it's the age of the people that take it on. And then there was a multi-use activity centre which had a lot of rooms in it, so that was quite a challenge too. But it's not just the building. It's about finding the right group, because they have to fully understand what they're taking on and be absolutely up for it, and know what all the implications are. The types of organisations that we've been involved with are from organisations like the Salvation Army, the Scouts, some local church groups, an alternative education provider, community associations, quite a few of those obviously, and community bowling clubs or community football clubs we're just getting involved with now. We also have, because a lot of the groups that were in occupation of these buildings were, they just wanted to run the activities. They weren't really interested in running the buildings. And so we try and marry up organisations. So we keep a note of any groups that are looking for buildings, either to take on or to run a lot of activities out of. And then we try and marry them up with some of these smaller groups to aid the sustainability. So one of the bowling clubs that's being transferred at the moment, the bowling club is taking on the transfer, and there was a bit of debate as to whether it should be them or the people who are supporting them, but they're taking that on, but they're taking it on in partnership with Age UK. So Age UK were looking for some space to run activities from. There is space within the bowling club to do the bowling pavilion to do that, and Age UK are going to be doing a lot of the grounds maintenance on behalf of the group, because they're not really sure what to do, and they're very young as an organisation, so they're going to support them in terms of governance and give advice on that sort of side of it too, in exchange for being given sort of free accommodation. So we try and keep the groups together sort of like that, really. But it's quite easy to weed out the ones which are only just wanting to run activities, and sometimes they do their best to push forward with an application, and you just think it's very difficult, because that's not the right group. So then you start thinking immediately, how do we do this? How do we solve the problem to get it across the line?
Really interesting. So if we zoom into one of the asset transfers you did, I know that the Wickham Community Centre was one of the first ones you did. It'd be really interesting to know how that worked, really, from beginning to end, and how it went from an idea to sort of handing over the keys and even afterwards.
Yeah, it's one that we started looking at in 2012. We wanted to reduce non-essential services, partly as part of the austerity measures that we were being made to introduce. And we started working towards transferring approximately 20 community centres, as you mentioned before. We knew that there was going to be some resistance, partly because they're community centres. So everybody loves a community centre. So we undertook a full range of consultation to get that buy-in right at the start. And we also took our time doing that. We had an advisory group, which was officer-led, talking about Fit for the Future. Was this the right way to be delivering services? We got that buy-in. Then there was a number of member seminars set up to talk about how the strategic approach that we were wanting to take, creating a network of community centres, not just our own, but right across the borough, sort of locating things strategically so that there was a community facility in virtually every location. And we got the buy-in from that, and the idea of transferring them to the communities, because there are a lot of privately run ones in the borough as well. We then talked to the management committees of the associations that would be affected by that, which was sometimes quite a difficult conversation. And then we started pushing out through the cabinet sort of portfolios, the leader, and then up through cabinet. But we also discussed it with local community organisations. So we discussed it with locality. That's what they were called at the time, with the old Development Trust. And we've got a couple of organisations local to Gateshead that we discussed it with as well, to explain what we were trying to do, to try and work out what sort of funding there was there. and also looked to groups looking for accommodation, because we knew that some of the groups within these community centres weren't going to be strong enough to take on the asset transfer. We obviously looked at the buildings. Were there any that we shouldn't be getting rid of that are sitting in the middle of a great big development site? And there was one, so we did a much shorter lease on that one. Running costs, strengths and weaknesses of the management committees, things like that. And then we got down to the crunch of giving the occupiers 3 big options really. 1, take over the building yourself. 2, allow another group to come in and take it over. Or 3, close the building. And a lot of them tried very hard, I have to say, to take the building over themselves, but some of them knew they couldn't. We had our community workers worked alongside them, and we phased it in over 3 years. So we started with the strongest groups that we knew could take the building on. It wouldn't be too difficult for them. They were very well set up. The buildings were pretty well used, and things, and the buildings were in reasonably good condition too. That always helps. And Wickham was one of the first of those in that phase. We still work closely with them on their business plan to make sure that it was a good, robust business plan, so they knew what they were going to be doing. We talked to them about grants. Wickham's in quite an affluent area, so they don't qualify for as many grants as some people. So then we had to do some thinking about, okay, so how do you raise money, and talk through things like that. Had a good, strong committee, and so there weren't too many issues from that point of view. We ended up doing some repairs to a wall at the back, more as a gesture of goodwill than anything else. So we didn't have to do that much work to it either. In terms of, we then went through the whole committee process, got approval to the lease, and got that all signed up. And since they've been in there, my involvement with them has been very little. If they need to do an alteration or something like that, I'm their landlord, so I would then approve that in a normal way that you would do for any sort of commercial lease. But it's the community workers that still continue to work alongside them. And when groups like that do get into trouble, they're the first ones to find out. They usually find out that they're getting into trouble and they know why. And then we start discussing, what do we need to do to try and resolve that? You know, is there something we can do, or is it going to, is it going to fail? Quite often we've had ones where we've stepped in where maybe a group has relied very heavily on one person to get it across the line. That person then becomes ill, and then almost the whole thing falls apart. And you're thinking, no, that's, we can't come this far and let it all fall apart. And we've been known to step in and then set up the organisation again to go, no, you need to think about who's going to take this on, who's going to take that on, and spread the load really, and help them out from that point of view. And that's sort of so that they flourish, that group do. So, and they've taken on a second building.
Brilliant. And so if that was one of the first asset transfers you've done, I mean, is there anything, what has Gateshead learned and how has its approach changed then as you've done more and more? Is there anything fundamentally that you're doing differently now?
There's some things we still do the same because we've learned about the political buy-in. So we still do that, and we work very closely with the councillors all the way through the entire process. We sort of consult them, and if we know that there's going to be certain issues, so when we've been doing the sports pitches, for example, we know that a number of them have previously not liked fencing being erected on some of these large areas of open space. So we tackled that sort of about 3 or 4 years ago, and got them to understand why that was needed, and so on. And in one area, we're having to find a more complex, let's call it a more complex solution. And we're working very closely with the councillors there to create some sort of part-time or sort of initial solutions. And we've got people signed up to be volunteers to mow the grass. Well, that shouldn't be happening at all. But it's keeping that bowling green open and operational. And that's what matters at the moment. We're talking to another group who will take it over, but they're not ready to yet. Accepting the fact that not all community asset transfers should be for nil rental. that building in Wickham, that's fine. That was a community centre. We never particularly charged for those ones, but we had quite a fight to get that accepted. There are some which I think we should have had rent review provision in, even if we hadn't charged initially. We should have had at least a rent review provision in there, so we could have gone back and revisited that. So there's a couple of buildings which I look at and it irks me that we haven't got a rent review provision in there. Providing the support, though, that's the big thing that we've learned from Wickham, is having that level of support and increasing that level of support. As I said, some people just want to, do an activity, and that's fine. We've increased the level of activity, level of support over the years, not just neighbourhood support and myself or my team. The energy team get involved. We talk through options with the groups when we're handing over the utilities. They can use we offer them the use of our provider, who provides a sort of a lower rate per square meter, cubic square foot, whatever. And we can arrange direct billing. Insurance, we've agreed with finance that they can insure their own buildings, which was something we weren't doing at the very start, as long as they're satisfying our finance department, because they can occasionally get it cheaper. Compliance, we offer to do the works, but if they don't want us to, that's absolutely fine. We just sort of hand it over. We hand over buildings very carefully with them to make sure they truly understand what they're doing, and we're doing that more and more. We learned a lot there when we did a community centre to a mental health group. We made a number of visits. We sort of said, you watch us do it, and then we'll come back the next visit, and then we'll watch you do certain things, and they gradually took over into 3 or 4 visits, but that was fine. And then, that again, they're flourishing. We've also added grounds maintenance to our list of people that are friendly and helpful. Especially with the bowling pavilions and the sports pitches, obviously they play a big part in that, of what people need to be doing, when they need to be doing it, what equipment they need to be using, and what sort of risk assessments they need to have in place, and all that sort of thing as we go. We generally take the view with support that we're not going anywhere. We're not abandoning them. So if they have a question, all they have to do is ring us and ask us. Sometimes you wish you hadn't said that, but that's a different matter altogether. But we're also looking at how we can support them once they're in place. We did have a networking system set up for the community centres, but that was quite labour intensive. It took a lot of time and resources. So we're looking at how we can do that. Maybe it's by newsletters. Can we just get the groups to talk to each other, set that up between themselves? But I think we're getting more conscious of that the more that we do. You're thinking there's a lot of these. Some of them, they're just tickety-boo, and some of them are just really going for it. And you see those ones, and you go, that's what we want for everybody. And it's almost like that. We want that learning to get sort of passed across, and going, you too could be like this sort of thing, really. The big other thing we've learned is understanding the running costs. I think is when we first started doing the asset transfers, we just took the property accounts as read and said, yes, that's how much it costs to run it. Not a problem. We just quoted what was ever against the property. When you drill down into those accounts, you realise that there's a lot of costs which aren't there because they were big global accounts at the time for compliance, possibly sometimes repairs, grounds maintenance in particular, caretaking, lots of things missing off those, some big costs missing off them. And what we've had to then do is drill down with finance to go, we need to be setting these against specific sort of property costs. And we're getting there. We're still not there. Grounds maintenance is still, a dark art. And depending on what you're transferring, also understanding those running costs. When you start looking at things like utilities, when we've been looking at the pavilions and the changing rooms, they're good fun. There's often shared utilities between a changing room and a pavilion. Sometimes there's no water bill in a park at all, which is always fascinating when there's a changing room with showers, and you think, well, there must be. And the other things we're learning from the pavilions is we're being asked for information to enable them to get Wi-Fi installation. We've never had Wi-Fi in these buildings, obviously, but they're wanting to put Wi-Fi into the buildings. But the providers are finding it difficult to actually locate the buildings. So they come back to us and go, we need more information. We need more information. Now we give them the what's called the eastings and northings, so they can find the buildings. And so far that seems to have worked. So that's good. Or they'll go, where do letters get posted to? Because there's no letterbox. You need a postcode for letterbox as well, and it's little bits and pieces like that, and which they come back and they ask things they think, I don't know, but I'll go and find out for you, and things like that. So yeah, we're still learning every day, which makes them enjoyable, I think, really.
Brilliant.